At the top of the crescendo, he owned them completely. 86 bows lifting as one, the brass banked and breathing, the timpani held a hair behind the beat where he liked it. And then his chest came apart like a snapped string, and he owned nothing at all. It did not hurt the way he expected. There was a wrongness first, a tear behind the sternum, the sensation of warm water poured into a place that should be dry. His left arm kept conducting. The downbeat he had rehearsed for 30 years was already descending, and he gave it. He gave it cleanly, and the orchestra answered. And somewhere between his wrist and their strings, the sound stopped reaching him. The fortissimo arrived. He could see it land. Rosin dust in the stage light, the cellist's jaw set. But the hall had filled with a flat white roar, the noise of a radio tuned to nothing, every frequency at once, and therefore no music whatever. He had spent a life teaching young players that silence is a pitch. This was not silence. This was the opposite of silence, the sound of all order leaving a room. His knees found the podium. The score slid. He watched 100 people he had built into a single instrument come apart into 100 strangers, the unison dissolving measure by measure, the second violins drifting sharp, the horns losing the center of the chord, and he understood with the last clean part of his mind that he was the tuning fork being taken away. Without him they were 40, 60, 80 separate frequencies. He had been the only thing holding them in tune. Then the white roar closed over his head and he went under it. Cold woke him. Not the gentle cold of an opened door, but the deep mineral chill of stone that has never once been warm, pressed along his spine through a thin palate, and he came up out of it coughing, a wet, tearing cough that doubled him forward and brought a thread of copper to his lips. He spat. He breathed. The breath came short, as though something behind his ribs had been tied off at half its length, and when he reached to press the place that hurt, his hand arrived in his sight, and it was the wrong hand. Young, long-fingered, unscarred at the knuckles where 40 years of baton work should have left their callus. The wrist was thin enough to ring with his thumb and middle finger, and when he turned it, the tendons stood up like the action of a clavichord, fine and unfamiliar, and obeying him perfectly. He lay still and did the only thing he had ever trusted. He counted. His pulse first, and it was bad, a syncopation where there should have been a metronome, every fourth or fifth beat arriving early and weak, a heart that played its part like a frightened student rushing the rests. 16 years in this body, he would learn, and the muscle already failing. He counted the drips next. Somewhere below him, water fell into water at uneven intervals, a leak with no sense of meter, and under that a second sound he could not place. A low, chained groaning, many throats, pitched almost too deep to be voices. The ceiling was stone vaulting, sweating. A single tallow lamp burned in a bracket and gave the room the color of weak tea. He sat up against the protest of the strange chest, and the world tilted, righted, tilted again, and he gripped the edge of the bed frame until the iron bit his soft new palm. Memory came not as story but as catalogue. Names he had never learned arrived already known. Solvain, the barony, the keep above him standing on cursed ground, its weight borne by mages shackled in the flooded dark, the cellars he could hear draining their slow arithmetic into the stone. A boy's whole life, filed and waiting, handed to him like a part he had not asked to sight-read. Aurel. He tried the name in the borrowed throat, and the cough took it from him. He should have been frightened. He searched himself for it the way he would search a section for a missing entrance, and found instead the old reflex, the one that had never failed him on any podium in any disaster. When the music collapses, you do not weep. You find the beat. You raise your hands and you bring them back. He raised a hand now. The young fingers spread of their own accord into the shape he had made 100,000 times. The conductor's open palm that says wait, that says together, that says listen to me and not to your fear. And they did not tremble for him. They trembled for the heart that drove them. Below, through the floor, The groaning rose half a step and would not resolve. He turned his head toward it, and the lamp swam, doubled, smeared its weak tea-light across the vaulting until the stones seemed to ripple like the surface of the water he could hear. The cold pressed in. He did not know which body the cold belonged to, the one bleeding out on a distant podium under hot white lights, or this one, drowning slow in a cellar at the edge of an empire he could not name. And for one long, unmetered breath, he could not have said his own name in either life. Only that something underground was singing, badly, in 47 keys, and waiting for someone to lift 2 fingers and count it in. How long had the door been open before he heard it breathe? He had not heard a footstep, no hinge, no skirt against stone, only a change in the room's resonance, the way a hall tells you someone has walked on stage before you turn to look. The lamp flame leaned. It leaned toward nothing, drawn sideways against its own logic, and the cold air bent with it, thickening near the doorway into something that pressed on his eardrums like depth under water. A girl stood in the warp, younger than him, barefoot, her eyes the flat pail of river ice that has frozen over a current still moving beneath. "You're awake," she said, "and your heart is wrong again." She could not have seen him. He understood that the way he understood an out-of-tune oboe, instantly, before he could explain it, because her face was turned a careful 15 degrees off from where he sat, listening past him, reading the room by some sense that had nothing to do with her ruined eyes. The air around her would not hold still. It shivered the way heat shivers off summer stone, except the cellar was cold enough to fog his breath, and where her bare hand brushed the door jamb, the grain of the wood seemed to ripple and resettle, as though it had briefly forgotten how to be solid. "Lyra," the catalog told him, his sister. "Come here," he said, and his voice came out the boy's voice, lighter than 40 years had taught him to expect. "And stand still so I can listen to you." She came. She did not stand still. She could not. The disturbance traveled with her, a localized weather, and as she crossed the room, the lamp guttered, and the dripping water below changed its pitch by a quarter tone, the whole cellar retuning around her passage. He had conducted a contralto once whose low notes rattled the brass of the second balcony. This was that, ungoverned, a fundamental with no ceiling, and no one minding the gate. "They told me you fell," she said, "on the wall walk. They said the curse took you the way it took father." Her fingers found his wrist and read the syncopation in it, every fourth beat rushing its rest, and her mouth went thin. "It's worse. You feel like a clock with a stripped tooth." "It is worse," he agreed. He turned her hand over in his and felt the air drag against the motion, viscous, alive. "What you're doing now, the way the room bends around you, who taught you to stop it?" "No one." She said it without self-pity, a fact filed beside other facts. "It can't be stopped. It only gets louder when I'm frightened, and I'm frightened nearly always, so." So. He held that word the way he'd hold a fermata, letting it ring out to its full and terrible length. He made her sit, and he made her talk, and what she gave him, in the level recitation of a child who has memorized the shape of the disaster because no adult would soften it, was the score of his new life. Solvane, a magocratic barony at the empire's frayed hem, its charter written in mage debt, its coffers a dry well. The standing crops had failed twice. The village below the keep, she counted the households for him, 11 of them now where there had been 30, lived on barley swept from granary corners, and on the rabbits the curse hadn't yet thinned. The mages chained in the flooded cellars were not labor. They were collateral. Living interest on a loan the barony could no longer service. "And the Inquisition," he said, because the catalog had handed him that name with a chill the boy's body remembered. "A writ is coming." Lyra's chin lifted, tracking a sound he couldn't hear. Rats, water, the slow groan beneath. "Steward Halvik has the letter. He won't read it to me, but I stood outside the counting room and the paper crackled when he folded it, and his quill scratched a long time after. Her warped air went very quiet, which was its own kind of loud. He's writing back. He means to give them the prisoners, all 47, for clemency, for the keep to be let alone. 47. The number landed in him like a downbeat he'd been waiting all his life to feel, and dreaded all the same. And below the floor, on cue, the chained groaning rose its stubborn half-step and refused, as it had refused all night, to resolve. "When?" he said. "The rider comes in 9 days." She did not blink. She had no need to. Halvik says 9 days and the debt is settled one way or the other. He says the Baron of Solvane is too sick to sign, so he'll sign for him. Her cold, small hand tightened on the boy's wrong heart's pulse. "Are you too sick, brother?" He did not answer her with comfort. Comfort was a tone he had never trusted. It flattened the truth, and the players always heard the lie in it. Instead, he counted. Her power thrumming the air, the 11 starving households, the 47 throats below, the 9 days, his own muscle skipping every fourth beat like a frightened student rushing toward its own last bar. And he laid all of it across the staff in his head and found, beneath the noise, the meter. 9 days to silence. He had conducted longer works on less, and he raised 2 fingers, and somewhere above them, a bell began to toll the watch. The torch he carried down was the brightest thing the stairwell had held in years, and the stone drank it. Each step bled the light a little paler, until by the 30th tread, the flame stood in its own small globe of orange, and the dark leaned in at the edges, patient, undiminished. He counted the steps. 40 years of pit rehearsals had taught his feet to keep a tempo his eyes couldn't verify, and the boy's lungs, 2 flights down, were already pulling like a bellows with a split seam. He stopped. He breathed against the count. The heart skipped its 4th beat, rushed, recovered, and he went on. The air changed at the landing. It thickened to the taste of wet iron and old tallow, and the cold stopped being weather and became a pressure, a hand laid flat against the sternum. Water met him first. Not a sound, but a logic of sound. Drops falling into standing pools at intervals that obeyed no bar line. A rain with no conductor, each splash arriving early or late against the last, so that no two made a beat he could name. He had spent a career hunting exactly this and killing it. Meterless. The cellar dripped like an orchestra tuning forever and never raising the baton. Then the torch cleared the vault's mouth and he saw them. 47. The catalog had given him the number. The number had not given him the smell, the rust and skin reek of bodies kept just short of dying, nor the way the chains caught his light and threw it back in 47 small, dishonest stars. They were set in the walls, not jailed, installed, fitted into iron collars bolted to the sweating stone at measured distances, a debtor here, a deserter slumped at the next ring, a heretic woman whose lips moved on a word she'd worn smooth, each of them spaced the way a luthier spaces frets, by a calculation that served the instrument and not the string. He walked the line. He held the torch high and read them as he would read a section before the first downbeat. Who was awake? Who was past it? Who tracked the light and who had stopped bothering? A man with a deserter's brand on his cheek lifted his head, and the water at his feet shivered into rings. A boy younger than this borrowed body had a frost of his own breath on the chain under his chin. The heretic woman's whisper, when Oral bent to it, was not prayer. It was counting. She had been counting longer than he had, and the groan, the stubborn half-step that had refused all night to resolve, was here. Not metaphor, source. It came out of them. Out of all of them at once, an involuntary fundamental wrung from 47 incompatible powers held too close, a chord that could not close because no two of these voices had ever been arranged to agree. The debtor's magic ground against the deserters, the heretics against the frost boys, each pulling the pitch a fraction the others could not match, and the dissonance that resulted was not music, and was not silence, but the long machine hum of bodies used as ballast. He had heard 100 welded players make one tone. This was the opposite art. 100 tones welded to make one hum, and the hum was load-bearing. He laid his palm flat against the stone between two of them. It was warm. Down here, in this mineral cold, deep enough to fog a torch, the wall under his hand gave back a faint blood heat, and he felt it move. Not crack, not settle, but flex. The slow give of a thing under strain that something was forever pushing back. He moved his hand higher and felt the warmth thin, lower, and it thickened. The heat pooled where the chains clustered. The stone was warmest exactly where the mages were densest, coolest where they were sparse. And he understood the architecture the way he'd once understood that the second oboe was flat because the radiator behind her had warped the reed. They were not collateral stored in a cellar. They were the cellar. They were the foundation. He stepped back and let the torch fall to his side and made himself see the whole of it as a score laid open across the dark. The keep above, its hall, its counting room, Halvik's quill, the 11 starving households, his sister's weather, his own wrong heart. Every stone of it standing on this hum, this unresolved half-step burning out of 47 throats to push back against the curse in the ground that wanted, very patiently, to pull Solvane down into the wet. The barony did not own these people. It leaned on them. The whole estate was a cord struck and held by force, and the holding was killing the players, and the killing was the only thing keeping the roof off the floor. Wealth and damnation. He had taken them for 2 facts, and they were one fact wearing 2 faces. The Frost Boy's chain ticked as he shivered. The heretic woman counted on. Somewhere behind him, a drop fell into a pool a half-beat late, and the late drop was the truest sound in the room, because it told him the meter was already broken, already begging, already waiting for a hand to come down and make the early and the late agree. He had 9 days to turn a curse into a cadence. He raised the torch, and for the first time the dark looked back at him as an orchestra looks at the stick. 47 faces, and not one of them yet his. The deserter's water shivered again, and this time Oral saw it. Not the ripple, above the ripple. Where the brand-marked man's power ground out of him, there hung a thing in the air that the torchlight did not touch and could not dim. A faint, ruled scaffold of lines, 5 of them, stacked and level, and riding those lines a single note, swollen black and trembling at the edge of its own duration. He blinked. It did not go. He moved the torch and the marks held still while the shadows swung, proving they were not after-image, not the wet glitter of strained eyes, but something his eyes were only the doorway to. A stave. Suspended in the dark. He was reading the deserter's magic off the air the way he had read ink off paper for 30 years in another man's lungs. He turned his head slowly, the way you pan a held breath across a tuning orchestra, and the cellar bloomed. Every collar wore its own ruled lines. The Frost Boys hung low and gray, a cluster of 16th notes shivering so fast they smeared into a tremolo. Each one rhymed at its stem the way the chain was rhymed under his chin. The heretic woman's score climbed in even quarter notes, patient, metered, a counting hand made visible. The debtors sagged under accidentals he could not afford, sharps and flats stacked 3 deep like unpaid columns in a ledger. They floated at the height of each throat. They overlapped where the players crowded, and thinned where the wall ran bare. And where 2 scores collided, the notes fought for the same line, and neither would yield the pitch. And there, exactly there, was the half-step groan he had hunted all night, written out plain as a misprint a copyist had been too tired to catch. He could see the mistake. He could see every mistake. His hands knew the shape of the next motion before he chose it. The right rose, 2 fingers and a thumb folding to the old grip, the wrist cocking back to ask the Frost Boy's tremolo to soften, to come down off its panic and sit. And nothing happened, because there was no note in him to give. The air around his own body stayed blank. Empty staves, ruled and waiting, not one mark on them. He brought the hand down against his thigh. That was the floor of it then, the whole and terrible arithmetic. He could not cast. 16 years in this body, and the body held no spark, no ember, not a quarter rest of power that was his to spend. The catalog had not bothered to tell him because everyone in Solvane already knew their Baron was a deaf spot in a country of singers. He would never sound a note. He would die having sounded nothing. The score hung everywhere around him, legible, generous, obscene in its completeness, and he was the one man in the cellar forbidden to play a bar of it. A drop fell. Late again. The heretic woman reached a number and started over. He stood in the cold and let the cruelty of it settle, weighed it the way he had once weighed a soloist who could not count against a hall already sold, and found, turning it, that the cruelty had a second face, as everything in this place did. He could not play. He could read. No mage alive read another's power. They felt it, feared it, married it blind, and burned for the mismatch. He saw the marriage on the page before the vows. He could see that the Frost Boys' smeared 16ths, dropped an octave and stretched to half their speed, would sit clean beneath the heretic's quarter notes. That the debtor's drowning accidentals were not wrong, only misplaced, a bass line written in the wrong clef. That the deserter's swollen black note wanted only a fifth above it to stop being a wound and start being a chord. The groan was not damnation. It was a voicing error. 47 players, each condemned for the ugliness they made alone. And the ugliness was arrangement. Only arrangement. The oldest fixable thing he knew. Put the soprano under the alto and you get mud. He had untangled mud for a living. He looked down the line at the suspended ledger of all their broken powers and began, without meaning to do the work his hands could no longer do. To assign, in his head, the frost boy to the low sustain, the counting woman to the pulse, the deserter to the held fifth, sorting 47 impossibilities into desks and sections and entrances, building the only kind of thing he had ever known how to build. He could not lift a sound, but he could tell 47 people who could, exactly when. The plan arrived not as hope. Hope was a luxury for men with healthy hearts and more than 9 days, but as a sequence of necessary labors, ruled and numbered, the way a score is only a list of instructions wearing a beautiful face. Tune them. Teach them to hear each other across the iron. Turn the load-bearing hum into a held chord that pushed back on the curse without grinding the players to meet. Resolve the half-step into a cadence, and let the cadence, not the agony, carry the roof. Take Halvik's instrument away from him, one string at a time. His wrong heart skipped its fourth beat and caught, and he let it, and did not look away from the air. 47 faces, 47 scores he alone could read. He raised 2 fingers, not to cast, to begin. The fire debtor laughed at the 2 raised fingers, a dry cough of a sound with no air behind it, and there was the reversal Aurel had not priced. The man chained deepest costed it nothing in every ledger of the keep. The first name Halvik, meant to hand the rider, hung the richest score in the room above his collar. Garrick. The catalog gave the name and a number beside it. 11 years' debt at an interest no harvest could ever clear. He went to him first. You tune the loudest instrument before it starts to bully the rest. Even in the standing wet the man threw heat. Aurel felt it on his shins 2 steps out, and on the wall behind the debtor's shoulders the stone had dried to a pale bruise, the only patch of dry rock in the cellar. The score told the rest. 3 deep, those accidentals, stacked sharp on sharp like unpaid columns running down a page no one had the funds to settle, and they pulled forward, always forward, every note arriving a hair before its beat, leaning into the next bar as if the present one had already failed him. He did not play wrong. He played early. A bass line set out in the wrong clef, hungry to be dropped an octave and slowed, misplaced rather than damned. "You fired a barn before you decided to," Aurel said. It was not a question. Garrick's jaw worked, and the dry patch on the wall spread a finger's width. The man rushed his own intentions the way he rushed the meter. He had run ahead, and the law had called it arson, and the law had not been entirely wrong, only incomplete. Aurel marked him first chair and moved down the iron. The twins sat linked, hand in wet hand, and their two staves hung identical at their two throats. Nessa and Vess, river-smelling, their hair gone to rope, each a single whole note held without bar line, without rest, without any rhythm to break it. No melody lived in either, no attack, no release. They could begin nothing and end nothing. They could only sustain, two open vowels that, once sung, would go on until the singer dropped. He understood the sentence against them in the time it took to read it. A held note alone is either silence or a flood. They had kept a well brimming past its lip one dry spring, sustaining the water because sustaining was the only verb they owned, and the overflow had taken a barley field down to black mud. Condemned for never letting go. "You will not have to start," he told them, "or stop. I will do both for you." Vess looked at the place his voice came from. Nessa kept counting the drip. Old Tomar he heard before he reached him, through the soles of his boots. A low drone below the lowest ruled line. A pedal tone so deep it lived under the floor of the staff rather than on it. The kind of note an organ keeps in its longest pipe when the organist has left the loft. The earth heretic's hands lay open on his knees, broad and cracked as split roots, fine grit packed under every nail. His drone never moved. That was its danger and its gift. Held alone against good masonry, it would walk the mortar out of the joints over a season, patient as frost, and bring a wall down so slowly no one could name the day it began to fall. Deadly by patience. Aurel laid two fingers flat on the stone and felt the whole cellar answer Tomar's pitch, the foundation itself tuned to one old man's grief, and he thought, "There is my ground. There is the floor I build the chord on." He climbed back toward the stair, toward the only player he could not chain to a desk. Lyra waited at the top with the lamp, and the flame leaned toward her, bent off true the way reeds bend in a current, because the air around his sister did not keep its shape. Her stave was the wrong one. It had no top line. The notes climbed off the highest rule and kept climbing, register stacked on register with no ceiling to fold them back, an absolutist's voice that obeyed no upper limit and never had. No writ condemned her. Nature had. A soprano who can rise forever does not blend, she erases. Put her over any section and the section becomes weather, becomes the thing that happens to the others rather than with them. And Aurel had spent 30 years teaching such voices to wait, to sit a third below the line, to want the chord more than the height, and none of those voices had been blind, or his blood, or loud precisely when most afraid. "You're counting them," she said. Her eyes held the flat pail of river ice, with the water still sliding underneath. "All of them. I can hear you doing arithmetic. You breathe through it." 47, he said. 48, she answered, and the lamp guttered as she said it, the flame ducking flat against the wick before it stood again. She had counted herself in. He had not meant to let her, and he could not afford to refuse. The loudest instrument in Solvane was the one he had no collar for, and 9 days would not teach her a ceiling she had never been born with. He looked down the line and back up it, scoring the room, each one a crime committed alone, each one a missing part. The boy who could sound no note lifted 2 fingers at a room full of mages who could level it, and the room laughed at him with smoke. Garrick went first, because Garrick always went first. That was the whole of his crime. Aurel gave the smallest upbeat, a half-inch of wrist, the gesture he had used on 1,000 nervous trumpets, and the fire-deader came in a full breath before the beat, his stave rushing 3 deep into the bar that did not exist yet, and the dry patch on the wall bloomed brown and then black. Tomar's drone shuddered out of true. The twins, hearing the meter break, did the only thing their sentence allowed. They held. Water climbed the gutter channel. Someone down the iron began to scream a note that had no business in any key, and the chord Oral had drawn in his head collapsed into weather and steam and the stink of scorched mortar. He brought his hand down flat. Not a cutoff. A slap against the rail that stung the new soft palm and stopped nothing. "Again," he said. "Again," Garrick repeated, mocking, the chain at his collar ringing as he leaned. "The little lord conducts. What do you spend conducting? Nothing. You can't even light the lamp you carry." Sweat ran the soot on his face into channels. "We burn. You wave." It was a fair ledger. Oral had read it himself in the catalogue that came to him whole. The keep knew its baron was null, a hollow pipe, a podium where a mage should stand. He did not argue the entry. He corrected the timing instead. "You came in early," he said. "Not strong, early, half a breath. You always do. And the law called it arson, but I am not the law, and I do not care that you are strong. I care that you are late to your own decision by being too soon to everyone else's." He set 2 fingers in the air and held them still. "Watch the hand, not the wall, not me, the hand. When it falls, you are not first, you are second. Nessa breathes, then you. I don't take a cue from a drowning woman, no, from the hand." He waited. The drip counted 4. "We have 9 days. I have already spent one of them watching you waste a barn you cannot get back. Watch the hand." He did not ask for fire. He asked for an entrance. That was the compression, and he applied it the way he had always applied it, by subtraction. No strength, no glory, no held crescendo for anyone to hide a sloppy attack inside. He took the chord apart down to the single most boring thing a player owns, the moment of beginning and the moment of ceasing. And he drilled those 2 moments alone, dry, unlit, the way a repetiteur drills a chorus on consonants until they hate him, and then, one morning, do not. Nessa first, because sustain was the easiest thing to begin and the hardest thing to stop. He gave the upbeat. She opened the vowel. The whole note hung from her throat without a bar line, going on as it always went on, and the field-drowning dread came up in her face because she did not own the verb that ended it. So he owned it for her. He counted 4 in his head, watched the water bead at the channel lip, and on the 5th he closed his fist clean and sharp, and her note stopped. Stopped. On his hand. Not on exhaustion, not on collapse, not on a barley field gone to black mud, on a 16-year-old's closing fist. Vess turned toward her sister in the dark and made a sound that was not a word. "Once more," Oral said. "You begin nothing. You end nothing. I do both. Your only labor is to trust the fist." He lifted it again. They were watching now, the 2 of them, watching the way a frightened animal watches the latch it has never seen open from the inside. He spent the 2nd day on cutoffs alone. Not one note sounded long. He wanted only the silence that arrives on command. He drilled them as a section. Drop the hand, the room goes quiet, no straggler, no tail of flame licking past the rest. And the first 40 times a straggler ran past, and it was always Garrick, and twice the wall charred, and once Tamar's drone kept walking after the others quit, and Oral felt a single grain of mortar tick loose against his boot, like the first pebble of a slope. He charted every failure, where the tail hung, whose entrance dragged. He did not raise his voice, because a conductor who shouts has already lost the count, and he had 30 years of not shouting under a heart that skipped every 4th beat and timed his patience for him, whether he liked it or not. Late on the 2nd night he gave the upbeat for a unison entrance. Nessa, then Garrick on the hand, Tomar holding the floor beneath them, and asked for nothing but 4 beats and a clean stop. Garrick watched the hand. He came in on the beat, not before it, on it, with the others. His rushing stave dropped an octave in his throat and slowed and held its place in the bar like a bass line finally set in the right clef, and Nessa's vowel sat over it, and the floor held Tamar's pitch, and for 4 counts the cellar made 1 sound instead of 48, and on the 5th, Aurel closed his fist, and every voice stopped together in a silence so square he could have ruled a line along its edge. 4 beats. Whole. Then nothing. Garrick looked at the unburnt wall, and then, despite himself, at the hand. By the 3rd morning the steam had stopped meaning what every steward had written it to mean. It hung in the groin vault, beaded on the keystone, dropped back cold onto the nape of his borrowed neck, and where the catalogue read ruin, he now read interval. Fire beside water made a hiss because someone had ordered them to stand on the same step and be one voice. 2 powers in the same register will fight. That was never damnation. It was crowding. He understood it the way he understood everything now. Too late to be memory, fast enough to be useful. Halvik's register kept a column inked in red. The incompatible marriages, the pairings the keep costed at the death of both partners. The frost woman set against the man who pulled heat from stone. The salt twins. Garrick against the water that drowned his fire to steam. Every line a verdict. He read them again by lamplight and found, under the red, not enemies but voices assigned the same pitch and told to sing it together. Move one down. Move one up. Give each its own clef, its own air, and the beating that had read as catastrophe resolved into a chord that could stand on its own legs. He started spacing them. The twins first, because they were already one sound, and he needed to learn how a doubled voice breathed. Nessa and Vess sat hand in wet hand, hair gone to rope, and when he gave the upbeat, they opened the same whole note in unison. And unison, for sustainers, is a wall. No air between them, so he split them a 5th apart, Vess beneath, Nessa above, and the wall opened into a window. The 2 vowels stopped grinding and began to ring, each holding the other up by standing somewhere the other was not. Vess made the wordless sound again. This time it had a pitch. Breathe before her, not with her, he told Vess, and set his palm flat, lifted it slow, the ordinary cruelty of asking a frightened singer to wait. You are the floor of her room. Floors come first. Then he stacked. Garrick at the bottom in his lowered clef, the 11-year debt no longer rushing because it had nowhere left to rush to. You cannot run ahead when you are the ground others walk on. The twins a 5th and an octave above, ringing. Old Tomar's subfloor drone beneath all of it, the pitch the keep itself was tuned to, the one note that had never once been wrong, only lonely. 4 voices. He raised the upbeat, dropped his hand, and the cellar made a sound with a shape. A triad with a doubled root and a held suspension over the top, dissonant by the book and entirely stable by the ear, the suspension leaning on the consonants instead of canceling it. Mortar did not tick loose. He waited for the pebble against his boot, and it did not come. He added a 5th voice, a 6th. The salt twins, condemned for turning a granary's grain to brine in a single night, he said as a pair of inner voices, close-spaced, the very crowding that had ruined the harvest, now doing the work crowding does well. Warmth, thickness, a body inside the chord. He moved the frost woman a tritone off the heat puller and told them the distance was the point, that they had been killing each other by being asked to embrace, that he would never ask them to embrace, only to ring at arm's length. The heat puller wept. The chord did not care, and that was the kindness. The work asked nothing of their history. Lyra sat on the bottom step with her blind face tilted up, counting. She had no collar. She was the 48th, the one voice he could not place because nothing in the room was her register, and she said nothing, only moved 2 fingers against her knee on his downbeats, keeping his time better than his own 4th skipping heart could keep it. He let her. A conductor takes the pulse where he can find it. By afternoon, they were listening to each other instead of to him. That was the threshold, the thing no engine of force could buy. Garrick lengthened his bottom note a hair because he heard Nessa run short of air, and Vess took the lower vowel earlier to give her sister somewhere to land, and the chord adjusted itself inside his frame without his hand touching it. 47 condemned people leaning their separate ruins against one another until the ruins held a weight. He stopped conducting. He stood with the lamp and let it ring. It rang for a count he stopped counting. Not steam, not a charred wall, not a slope letting go in the dark. A chord, deliberate, 8 voices wide and standing square on Tomar's floor, the suspended note overhead neither attacking nor releasing, only sustained. The twins doing at last the one thing they had been broken for, never letting go, and being right too. 9 days and he had spent 3. He closed his fist anyway, late, almost gentle, and the sound stopped clean. And in the silence after it, the drip from the keystone fell once onto his neck, cold, on the beat, as though the stone had finally learned to come in on the hand. "The Baron's signature, when he is well enough to hold a pen," said Halvik from the top of the stair, and the lamp he carried was lit, the small, bright insult of it falling down the steps to where Oral's own lamp sat dark on the floor. He had a paper in his free hand. Cream stock, a wax seal the color of a healing scab, the Inquisition's writ unrolled just far enough to show the column of names. 47 of them. He read 3 aloud, the way a man reads a butcher's tally, unhurried, certain the meat will not object. And at the bottom, he had left a blank for clemency to be paid in bodies. "Clemency," Oral said, "for Solvain, for your sister, who is also on no one's list yet." Halvik let that sit. "The rider comes in 6 days. He will take what is owed, and the keep will stand quit of its debt. And the Baron," a glance down at the dark lamp, "will not be asked to do the one thing a Baron cannot do." It was a clean cut. Oral felt where the blade went in, not at his pride, which had no nerves left, but at the thing he had spent 3 days growing in this wet room, the listening, the leaning, the 47 separate ruins he had taught to hold a weight together. Sell the foundation, and the curse comes up through the floor. Halvik knew that. Halvik had decided the curse was slower than the rider. He could not threaten the man. A null boy with a syncopated heart threatens no one. He could not buy him. The treasury was the column of names. So he did the only thing his hands knew how to do. "Garrick," he said, not loudly, "first chair, you named me null to my face. We burn, you wave. You were right about the entry." The fire debtor's chains shifted. Water moved. "You were wrong about everything that comes after." Oral turned from Halvik entirely, which was its own kind of arithmetic. You do not argue with the man holding the paper. You make the paper irrelevant by changing what the room is listening to. 11 years you have rushed every count because you were taught your gift was the strength in it. It is not. The strength is the loudest thing in you and the least true. Underneath it there is a note you have never been allowed to hold, and I have heard it twice now, on the second night and again this afternoon. A low E that wants to be the ground and keeps being asked to be the flame. Silence, the kind that has a shape. Sing the E, not the fire, the floor. Garrick sang. One note, low, no light in it at all, dry and unlit the way Oral had drilled them. And it was the true thing, stripped of the 11 years, the man and not the debt. Oral let it ring 4 beats and closed his fist, and it stopped clean. He moved down the line. He did not perform. He named, the way a repetiteur names consonants, flat and exact. The frost woman's pitch sat a half-step lower than her fear let her sing it. The salt twins beat against each other because they breathed a fraction apart, and he showed them the fraction. Old Tomar's drone was the only note in the keep that had never once been wrong, and he said so. And the old man's chin came up off his chest for the first time in 3 days. Halvik's lamp did not move. Its light still reached the bottom step, Useless now, a coin held out to people who had stopped wanting coins. "You hear a parlor trick," the steward said, and his voice had thinned. "I hold a writ." "You hold a list of names." Oral finally turned back to him. "I have the notes the names were hiding." That was the whole of it, and the room understood the difference before Halvik did. A name is what the Inquisition writes when it means to spend you. A note is the one true thing left when the debt and the crime and the fear are subtracted away. And Oral had just stood at the bottom of a flooded stair and given each of 47 condemned people the sound of themselves, unspent, on the beat. Nessa spoke first, who had not spoken once. "We don't sing for the paper." "Floors come first," Vess said beside her, and it was Oral's own instruction handed back to him, made into a vow. It traveled the cellar the way a tuning travels a section, one desk taking the pitch from the next, the Salt twins, the heat puller with his wet face, the frost woman at her arm's length, Garrick last and lowest, the low E rising again under all of them without being asked. Not a roar, not a wall. 8 voices, then 12, then a number Oral stopped counting, leaning their separate ruins against the boy who had bothered to hear what was buried under the ruin. And the chord they made was a refusal with no fire in it, square on Tomar's floor, addressed to the man on the stair. Halvik took one step down toward the dark lamp, then stopped, the cream paper trembling at the edge. Lyra lifted her blind face from the bottom step, 2 fingers still keeping Oral's time, and into the held chord she added, very quietly, a note that had no top to it, and the whole stair went cold, as the steward felt the floor begin to climb. What were they reaching for, in the half-second after the chord stood clean? He saw it before he understood it. The Salt twins turned their palms inward, the heat puller pressed 2 knuckles flat against his own sternum, and an old woman at the drowned end of the row mouthed 3 syllables that belonged to no ledger Halvik had ever red-inked. Not a prayer. The shape was wrong for prayer, too many stops, a grammar that closed like a latch. The water lapped the bottom step and did not answer. Oral filed it where he filed everything, between the entrances and the failures, and went on listening. Halvik climbed. 1 step, then the rest, the cream paper held away from his body like a thing that had begun to smell. The dark lamp swung once and threw a long shadow up the curve of the stair, and then the door took him, and the cellar belonged again to the 47 and the cold. Nobody cheered. They had learned in 3 days that a held note costs more than a shout. He waited until the chord had bled all its overtone into the stone, then crouched at the edge of the black water and asked the old woman to say the 3 syllables again. She would not, at first. Tomar said them for her. His drone cracked open into speech the way a hinge gives, reluctant, then all at once. And the sound that came out was not the keep's common tongue, and not the priest Latin of the writ, but something with vowels that bent in the middle, that climbed a step and resolved a step, each word carrying its own little cadence inside it like a swallowed bell. "Marriage tongue," Tomar said, in plain speech, ashamed of it. What the binders sang when they wed one of us to another. Before the chains. Old superstition, my lord. We're told not to keep it. Superstition. Oral had heard that word used to bury every rule a man was too frightened to count. He asked the old man to say a single phrase twice, once as it was sung when the upper mage led, once when the lower did, and the difference arrived in his ear with the clarity of a tuned fifth. The verb changed its tail depending on who stood beneath whom in pitch. The grammar declined by altitude. A power that sat below another took one ending. A power that rose above took another. And the word for to hold together refused to exist at all unless both endings were present in the same breath. Spacing again. The same law he had drilled into them with his dry, unlit hands, written into the bones of a language 100 years before he was born into this dying boy. His pulse skipped its 4th beat. He ignored it and asked for more. They gave him more, the way an orchestra surrenders a part once it trusts the stick. Tomar the verbs, the old woman the vowels she had kept like coins swallowed in a famine and never spent. The salt twins a counting rhyme that turned out to be a rule for which of two beating tones must yield. Oral took it in at a speed that frightened them and did not frighten him. 30 years of absorbing a score on a single reed had left grooves in a mind that the new skull could not erase, and he heard their dead language the way he heard a transposition, not as foreign marks but as the same intervals wearing different clothes. Conjugation was modulation. Declension was voicing. The whole alien thing fit together under his ear like the staves of a barrel drawn tight, every word a hoop forced over green wood until the seams pressed watertight. "You learn it wrong," the old woman said, almost angry. "Quick is wrong. We bled to learn it slow." "I'm not learning it," Oral said. "I'm recognizing it." Lyra had not moved from the bottom step. Her blind face was tilted up into the black, her 2 fingers still keeping his time out of habit, and when the old woman spoke a binding vowel, Lyra's mouth shaped it back without being asked. Not the consonants, she could not catch those, but the pure tone underneath, the part that had no edges, the fundamental finding the fundamental. Wherever the marriage tongue had been born, it had been built on a voice like hers, a ground note for the rest to be married above. She said, very low, "It sounds like the cellar, when it hums." It did. He had been hearing it for 3 days and refusing the comparison because the comparison was monstrous. The groan that held the curse back, the dissonant load-bearing hum of 47 condemned throats, was not random suffering. It was this tongue, decayed. A wedding sung so badly, so long, by people chained too close and spaced too wrong, that the words had rotted off and left only the beating between mismatched pitches. The marriage curdled into the cellar's drone. He stood too fast and the room tilted, the syncopated heart stumbling, and he put a hand on the wet rail until the floor came back. Tomar, the word the binders used last. At the end of every wedding, you stopped before it. The old man's chin dropped. "We don't say that one. That one's for joining a person to a place." Oral went very still, because the keep was a place, and his father had died of it, and somewhere in the foundation, 100 years of badly married mages were holding up a curse with the broken grammar of their own vows. "Say it slowly," he said. "I'll keep the time." The word Tomar, finally let out, had no grammar Oral could parse, and that absence was the whole of it. Every other piece of the marriage tongue declined by altitude, conjugated by who stood beneath whom, behaved like an instrument under trained hands. This one refused. It would not sit on a stave. It would not even agree to a key. He heard it, and the floor of his understanding gave, the way a foot finds a stair that isn't there in the dark, that half-second where the body keeps falling and the mind has not yet been told. "That's not a word," he said. "It's the oldest one." Tomar's knuckles had gone the gray of cold tallow on the rail, and the rail itself was sweating, the cellar breathing its damp up through the iron. "It's a pitch," Oral said. "It's notation." He had the old man say it a 3rd time, and listened the way Lyra listened, beneath the consonants to the thing they were dressed over. And the thing underneath was not meaning. It was instruction, a shape that told a voice where to bend, when to yield, how far to lean off true before the note tore. Not a spell that did the work, a mark that told the work how to move, the way a slur over 4 notes does not make the sound and still owns it entire. Somewhere upstream of every chained throat in this cellar, a first voice had sung this and never once been taught. The old woman made a sound he hadn't heard from her, dry, nearly a laugh, the rasp of a soul on grit. "You know what sang it." Her 3 swallowed syllables again, then plain speech, bitter as rind. "Not men. Men wrote it down, badly, the way a deaf man copies a tune off watching lips move. The binders stole the marks. The marks were never ours." Whose, then? Drake's, Tomar said. The word dropped into the empty space in the grammar and filled it, the way a missing pipe explains a whole silent rank. A dead tongue. Not lost so much as borrowed down to rags, the speech of things that did not converse but composed, that built weather and stone, and the lean of a flame into sentences. The marriage tongue was a fragment torn from it, one pamphlet ripped from a library that had burned. Frightened men with a notation they couldn't read had used it the only way frightened men use anything they fear. To chain. Aurel turned toward the deep of the cellar, where the water went black and gave nothing back to the lamp, and the drone lived, a sound you felt in the wet of your own throat before you heard it. 3 days he had filed that groan as load-bearing dissonance, 47 mismatched throats beating against one another, a chord held so long it had gone to gravel. Now he heard what it copied. Under the keep, in the ground his father had died of, something vast lay wounded past the use of its own voice, unable to hold its own song. So the foundation had been forced to sing it for the beast, badly, in human throats packed too close, the marriage curdled into a wall of beating tones. The curse was not a sentence laid on Solvane. It was a creature choking on a phrase it could not finish, holding the breath at the bar line and never arriving at the downbeat. Lyra's lamp leaned. The flame bowed off true toward her, a reed in a current only she made, and she said, not to him, "It wants its note back." She lifted her 2 fingers, the ceilingless line, the ground with no top rule to fold it home, and let the binding vowel out clean, no edges, no beating, a single tone that the drone in the dark reached for and, for the length of one held breath, matched. The cellar changed pitch. Not louder, truer. He felt it in the teeth first, then the sternum. 47 throats that had ground on each other for 100 years felt one correct note arrive among them, and bent toward it without being told. The way iron filings turn at a lodestone, the way a hall of strings finds the oboe's A, and the whole room exhales into tune. He understood then what he was holding, and began helplessly to rank it. Who could carry the dragon vowels, who only the floor? Tomar to the verbs, the salt twins to the yielding rule, the old woman as keeper of the marks. No soloist had ever done this. Not the screaming mage alone in a flooded cell, not the inquisitor with his one Latin word of clemency. One voice was a needle. It could not be a chord. A choir, spaced right, sung in true unison in the Drake's own notation, could make the single clean chord the world's magic was built to recognize. The root the beast had lost, handed back in 47 voices instead of 1. His pulse skipped its 4th beat, and this time he did not ignore it. He counted it, because the arithmetic had changed and every figure mattered now. 9 days to teach a dead tongue to 47 dying people. 9 days to drill the bend, the yield, the lean off true, to space the bodies in the wet dark by the carry of their voices. 9 days to build, from a cellar of the condemned, the only voice that had ever answered the thing in the ground. Far below, in the black water, the drone stopped beating. It was listening back. By the 4th day, the chained who could not be trusted with a spoon were correcting one another's grip on a stub of charred pine. He had scraped a flat of slate clean with his belt buckle, ground the char to powder against the wall, and begun to set the dead tongue down where a living person could follow it. Not the binder's terrified scrawl, but a score. 5 lines clawed across the stone, and a clef of his own devising planted where the drakes had kept altitude. He started where he always started, tempo. The thing in the water held its breath at the bar line and never arrived, so the choir had to carry a pulse it could not drop. And since his own heart skipped its 4th beat like a lame horse refusing a gait, he gave the count to Lyra, her 2 fingers. He marked them at the head of the slate, a downbeat that did not come from him, and wrote beneath it, in plain letters the old woman could spell, "We take the pulse where we can find it." Garrick read it aloud, stumbling. The Salt twins read it back without a stumble. By noon, The line could keep 4 bars without his hand, and he took his hand away to prove it, and it kept. Key was the hard turn, the place where superstition had to become arithmetic or fail. The drakes had not conjugated by tense, they declined by height. A verb sung low meant the floor, the ground, the root that wanted to bear weight. The same verb lifted a fourth became the flame, the lean, the weather. He drew it as a staff because that was exactly what it was. Conjugation is modulation, declension is voicing. He did not teach them grammar. He had never had it to teach. He showed them a ladder and named the rungs, and watched a room full of people who had been told their whole lives that the marks were holy and forbidden discover that the marks were merely high or low. "That's all it is," Tomar said, and something in his ruined face came unstuck. That's all it ever was. Dynamics he stole from his own dead trade without apology. Loud and soft were not volume here. They were how much of a body's power crossed the throat at once, and a mage who emptied himself in the first bar would arrive at the cutoff a husk. So he taught restraint as a written instruction, a hairpin opening and closing on the slate, and he walked the rows in the wet dark with the lamp and pressed 2 fingers flat to a sternum to feel whether the breath obeyed the mark. Nessa breathed first. Garrick second after her, where he could not rush. He had charcoaled a small numeral 2 beside the man's name and circled it twice. And when Garrick watched the figure instead of the wall, his racing line dropped its octave and slowed and set. A base finally laid in the foundation it had been fighting all along. Cutoffs last, because a phrase that does not end clean rings into the next and rots it. He showed them the closing of a fist, late and almost gentle, the gesture that stopped a held cord without bruising it. And he made the old woman the keeper of it, keeper of the marks, of where each line released, because her ear was the driest and least forgiving in the room. She practiced the cut on a candle flame until it died on the beat and not before. With the apparatus built, he went down the line and named them. Not the voices they had carried in, the ones that had burned a barn or boiled a well and gotten them dragged down these stairs, but the voices the counting had found. 4 days of measurement had told him what each throat was for, and he had learned in his first life that you do not give a player his part. You hear it, and you hand it back. He stopped at Garrick first, because the man was braced to be told he was wrong. "You are the floor," he said. "Base. Everything I build stands on you, and the only thing you have to learn is that the floor does not hurry." He touched the circled 2 beside the name. "Lo, after Nessa. You have spent your whole life trying to be the weather, and you were always the ground." Garrick's jaw worked. "And if the ground gives?" "Then we all fall," Oral said. "So it won't." He went on. Nessa he named the breath, the one who opened the door because her lungs were the only honest thing in the room. The Salt twins he set a fifth apart and told to stop agreeing. He wanted the interval, not the echo. Tomar he gave the lean, the fourth above the root, the flame that did not consume because it had a floor beneath it now. The deaf man he stood where he could read every mouth and called him the eye of the line, the one who would carry the tune when the dark took the rest. Lyra he left alone. She was the pulse, time itself standing at the head of the staff in 2 fingers, and a clock does not need a pitch. He came last to the old woman. "Keeper," he said. "I know what I am," she said. He let it stand, because she was right, and because that was the whole of his creed, the only thing his dead trade had left him worth keeping. A voice was not a feeling a person had about themselves. It was a fact about how the air moved when they opened the throat, and a fact could be measured, and a measured thing could be set on a wall and kept after the body that made it was gone. He had spent his first life believing beauty was given. He spent these days proving it was only ever found. Then he did the thing that turned a drilled rabble into a faction that could outlive him. He handed them the slate. Not the cure, the method. He copied the clef and the ladder and the hairpins onto squares of broken roof tile and gave one to each desk, and made them transcribe the line beside them, mage to mage, so that no single throat held the whole score and no single death could erase it. The deaf man's tune, copied off watching lips, became a tune anyone could read off the wall. By the sixth pass, the Salt twins were arguing about a voicing, whether a word sat better a fifth apart or a fourth, and the argument was correct, and the correction was theirs, not his. He stood at the rail and let the cellar rehearse without him. 47 voices, spaced by the carry of their sound in the wet, climbing the ladder of altitude and releasing on the keeper's fist. 100 years of beating gravel sorting itself, bar by bar, into something that could be read, repeated, taught to the next frightened soul they dragged down these stairs. His pulse skipped. He counted it. 3 days gone of the 9, and the figure that had terrified him now sat on the slate like any other tempo marking. A hard number, met with labor. The old woman tested her cutoff one final time. The candle guttered, held, and snuffed exactly on the downbeat, a thread of gray smoke standing straight up off the dead wick in the still air of the cellar, like a baton set down after the last bar. Again, she said before he could. He had not given the order. She had read it off the wall. The problem was arithmetic, and it had a name, and the name was his sister. A choir tunes to a root. Every voice in the cellar climbed its ladder of altitude and released on the keeper's fist. But they climbed away from nothing. 47 pitches spaced and true and resting on empty air. Because the one note they all leaned toward, the fundamental, the floor beneath Garrick's floor, did not exist in the room. He had written it into the score 4 days ago without letting himself read what it cost. A root low enough, steady enough to hand a drake its lost breath, could come from one throat only. Lyra's. He had measured her the first night and lied to himself about the figure. Her voice had no ceiling. Most singers tire toward a limit, the body breaking before the chord tears. Hers braked nowhere, gave everything, a pure tone that would climb and hold and climb until something in her gave way instead of the note. Absolute pitch with no instinct for self-rescue. He had made her the pulse to keep her hands busy and her throat shut. 2 fingers. A clock needs no pitch. The score needed one. He stood at the rail and did the sum he had refused for 3 days. 47 held nothing without a root. The root spent the only person in the keep he had been dropped into this body to protect. He counted his own heart. The skip on the 4th beat, faithful as a metronome with a chipped tooth, and understood that he was being asked to spend a life to buy lives, that the ledger did not care which, and that he did. "Read me the bottom line," Lyra said. She had heard the silence change shape. "There isn't one yet," he said. "There is. You wrote it on the 2nd night, and you've been walking a circle around it ever since." She turned her face up, the cold light off the standing water laying a gray sheen along her cheekbone. "I felt you measure me. You went quiet the way Father went quiet before the keep took him." He told her the truth, because she would hear a lie in the spacing of the words. The drake needed its root. The root had no ceiling. The voice that could give it might not climb back up the stairs. She was still for the length of 4 bars. Then, "How long must I hold it?" "Until the beast catches the breath. I can't know. 8 bars, maybe 40. "Then count for me," she said, "since your heart can't." He set her at the head of the staff where she had always stood, and took the 2 fingers' work back into his own unfit hand. The keeper lifted her fist. Down the wet line, 47 throats opened out of the dark, and this time he did not ask them to fail. Nessa came first. Breath, the honest lungs, the door. Garrick settled under her, the floor that did not hurry. The Salt twins split their 5th and refused to agree, and the interval rang where the echo used to smear. Tomar leaned his 4th across the root and did not consume it. The deaf man watched the keeper's mouth and carried his line off the wall, a tune that needed no ear, only an eye. Then Lyra found the floor beneath the floor. It came up out of her without strain at first, the way water has no weight until you lift it. A tone so low and without edge that he felt it in the rail before he heard it. in the standing flood, in the bad valve of his own chest. The drone in the stone reached for it. 100 years of beating gravel, of mismatched pitches grinding their half-steps raw, leaned in and found the breath it had been choking on. The bar line came. The downbeat arrived. The drake, voiceless beneath them all, took its root from a blind girl and held. The beating stopped. Not softened. Stopped. The cellar went to one sustained pitch, 47 human throats, and a single stone one in a unison so clean it had no width, and the stillness inside the sound was the largest thing he had ever conducted. Water moved. He heard it before he saw it. The flooded floor draining down through cracks that were closing, the level dropping a hand's breadth. 2. The salt line crawling down the walls as the keep took its own weight back onto a foundation that finally agreed with itself. Lyra held it. 8 bars. 12. Her knuckles whitened in her skirt, her throat one drawn chord, the tone never wavering because she had no ceiling to waver toward. And he watched her give what had no bottom, and he let her, because the work required it, and he had decided. He gave the keeper the sign at 16. The dry old fist came down late and gentle, the way it had killed the candle on the beat and not before, and the unison released as one body. Lyra folded at the knees into the draining mud, a thread of blood bright at her lip, her 2 fingers still, absurdly, faithfully, beating time against her thigh. For one breath the cellar had not held 47 prisoners. It had held an orchestra. He was already down the stairs, her wrist in his hand, counting her pulse against his own broken one, and finding the triumph and the toll arriving in the same measure, that hers, even spent, even fading, still kept better time than his. The keep had not finished agreeing with itself when the gate horn cut the morning in half. Wrong day. He knew the count cold. 9 days promised, the rider due at the 9th dusk, and this was the 7th morning, the slate barely dry, the salt line still crawling down the cellar walls like a tide deciding whether to leave. He had built the whole apparatus to a tempo. Someone had just torn the bar in 2. 3 riders on the drained causeway. Not one clerk with a writ in an oilcloth tube, not the bored functionary he had rehearsed against, but 3 figures on horses the gray of wet ash, moving in a spacing so even it could only be drilled. He learned them before they reached the wall. You read a player by how he sits his instrument. He read these 3 by the air around them, each carrying a single tone at throat height, hard-edged, unwilling to bend. Soloists, every one, trained never to share a desk. He set Lyra against the wellhead with Nessa's shawl beneath her and her 2 fingers still keeping their faint time, and went to meet the gate with a heart that skipped its 4th beat and a face that did not. The tallest dismounted without hurry. Older than he had pictured the order, a woman with a mouth like a closed ledger, she looked at him the way a buyer looks at a horse whose seller has lied about its age. The Baron of Solvane. Not a question. We came ahead of the paper. The paper is slow, and the harvest is perishable. Harvest. He kept his hands flat on the cold iron of the well ring. She read the Bailey while she spoke, and he watched her do it. The drained yard, the dry stone, the keep standing on a foundation that no longer screamed. The boy who should have been 3 seasons dead standing upright in front of it. None of it surprised her face. All of it revised her plan. He saw the recalculation move behind her eyes, the way he had seen the drake reach for Lyra's root, an old hunger, finding a fresh vessel to pour itself into. "You expected ruin," he said. "We expected a debtor." Her 2 companions had not stepped down. They sat their ash-gray mounts and turned their heads toward the cellar mouth, toward the low warmth still rising off 47 cooling throats, and he understood, with the cold, clean arithmetic he had learned to trust, precisely where they meant to cut. Not at him. He was one boy with a bad heart and no note in him. Toppling him bought nothing, freed nothing, harvested nothing. The cellar was the asset. The thing he had spent 9 days assembling down there, the spacing, the chord, the readable score chalked on the roof tiles, the agreement that now held the whole keep aloft, was the only structure in Solvane worth the breaking. They had read the room. They would not seize the conductor. They would unstring the instrument. The second inquisitor opened his mouth. What came out was not speech. It was a single tone, narrow as a wire, pitched with a surgeon's exactness to sit a half-step under Garrick's floor. The very interval he had spent 9 days teaching the line to lean away from, the smear, the old raw wound in the stone. A soloist's weapon. Find the foundation, sour it. Down in the cellar the unison flinched. He heard it go. Garrick's steady floor wavered as the foreign half-step crawled beneath it. The Salt twins' clean fifth began to fray at the edges. The agreement he had built out of 47 mismatched lives tilted 1 degree back toward the chaos it had climbed out of. Water shivered in the drains. The keep, so newly at peace with its own weight, drew a breath it should not have needed to draw. He had armored every line but the one that could not stand again. The root lived in a single throat, and that throat lay emptied against a wellhead, blood drying at its lip, a girl too spent to climb a stair, let alone a register. Garrick could hold the floor only while Lyra held the floor beneath it. He had spaced the chord, named the parts, trained the breath, built the faction note by note out of the condemned, and left the keystone lying in the mud where anyone with eyes could find it. The third inquisitor swung down from the ash-gray horse. He had not spoken once. He did not speak now. He crossed the dry bailey with the unhurried certainty of a man walking to a chair that has always been his single-held tone sharpening as he came, fine as a nail drawn down slate, and he passed Oral as though the Baron of Solvane were merely a post to hitch a horse to. Straight for the wellhead, straight for the one spent throat that carried the root of everything standing. Oral raised 2 fingers. His heart skipped its 4th beat. The Inquisitor reached for Lyra's jaw. The Inquisitor's fingers stopped a hand's width from Lyra's jaw. Not by his will. The air there had thickened, the way pond water thickens in the hour before it skins with ice, and his hand hung in it, shaking, the long tendons standing up under the skin like plucked strings, while behind him a sound he did not own rose out of the stone and would not let his fingers close. Oral had not touched him. He never could. There was no note in him to throw, no wire of tone to draw down a man's spine, and he had stopped mourning that hole in himself somewhere around the 4th night, when he understood what it freed him to do. He had something the 3 soloists did not. He had 47. He stepped up onto the well ring, 2 fingers raised, and stood on the only podium Solvane had ever given him. A rim of cold iron above a drained shaft, his sister at his feet, his orchestra under the floor. The tallest inquisitor turned her ledger mouth toward him at last. Too late. The downbeat was already falling. 12 notes. He had arranged them in the dark like a man stacking stones against a flood, each chosen not for its beauty, but for the way it braced the next. And he brought them in now, one at a time, the slow legato of a structure deciding to stand. First Garrick. The floor, the patient bass who could hold a single pitch until his lungs failed, but had never once in his life been able to bend it. A flaw, on a desk that needed flexibility. A virtue here. Oral set him directly beneath the soured half-step, and Garrick did not chase it or correct it. He simply sank below it and held, turning the surgeon's wound into the lowest rung of a ladder, the raw interval becoming the very ground the cord would lean toward. The second inquisitor's narrow tone wavered. His weapon had been the gap under the floor, and the floor had just grown a cellar beneath his cellar. Then the Salt twins, whose clean fifth always frayed when they were frightened, fraying being exactly the texture Oral wanted now, a fifth with a burr on it, rough enough to grip the smooth bore of a soloist's pitch and refuse to let it slide free. Then Nessa, who could not start a note without a tremor. He gave her the entrance that needed a tremor, the shiver above the fifth that made the whole stack read as breathing rather than masonry. each defect slotted, each weakness the load-bearing answer to someone else's. This was the thing the order had never learned in all its drilling. 3 voices, each flawless, each alone. They had been trained never to share a desk, and so they had never discovered the one arithmetic that mattered. That a tone with no edges cannot be cut, only surrounded, and that a wall does not beat a knife by being sharper. 6th note. 7th. The chord climbed. He felt his heart skip its 4th beat and conducted straight through the gap, the way he had learned to, letting the count live in his 2 fingers where the muscle could not be trusted. A clock does not need a pitch, Lyra had told him, and he kept the clock now though hers had stopped. Her fingers had gone still in the mud. He did not look down. Looking down was a luxury the score did not have time for. The 8th voice was a woman who stuttered her consonants, useless for the marriage tongue's long-bound vowels, perfect for the percussive attack that drove the foreign half-step out of the cellar's ceiling and pinned it where Garrick could swallow it. The 9th and 10th he had paired weeks ago, 2 men who hated each other and sang a hair apart. And that hair, that ugly inch of beating between them, was precisely the shimmer that made the foreign soloist's single clean tone sound suddenly thin, suddenly poor, suddenly like one voice trying to argue with a town. The middle inquisitor broke his wire. Aurel heard it snap, heard the half-step fold back into the rising chord and become, against the man's whole intent, the leading tone that wanted to resolve upward into Garrick's root. His own weapon, recruited. Conscripted desk to desk like everything else in this keep. 11th note. The tile he had chalked that morning was doing its slow work in 47 separate hands. No single throat held the whole shape, and so no single throat could be cut to end it. They had come to harvest an instrument and found a faction, drilled, spaced, written down on broken roof tile, able to keep playing if the man on the well ring fell dead at the next skipped beat. The 3rd inquisitor's hand still hung above his sister's jaw, locked in the thickened air, the cord pressing on him now from every direction the way deep water presses on a diver's ears. Aurel held the 11th note and did not give the 12th. He let the silence load. The whole stack leaned forward, unresolved, a held thing wanting its last rung, the 3 soloists frozen inside a structure none of them could read. And he stood weaponless on his iron rim, 2 fingers up, lungs full, the downbeat for the final note balanced on the edge of his nail, and did not yet let it fall. The nail dropped. He gave the 12th note the only way an unfit body could give anything, 2 fingers cutting down through air gone thick as well water, and the 11 rungs that had leaned so long, starving, found the floor beneath the floor and quit trembling. Garrick took it first. The patient bass, who had never in his life bent a pitch, sank 1 last inch and locked, and on that floor the stack stopped being masonry and became a forge door swung wide. Not flame flung outward, but heat drawn in, gathering, the slow rush of a thing that had decided at last to move. Beneath him, Tomar drove the air. The man could not end a note. No cadence lived in him, no rest, and he breathed through his nose to keep one tone running unbroken past the point any lung should manage, useless on a desk that needed silence. And here the bellows under Garrick's fire, pumping it, feeding it, refusing it the breath in which it might have died. The Salt twins held the 5th. Their interval frayed, as it always frayed when they were frightened, and the fraying was a rope laid taut now, rough-fibered, gripping the smooth pitches of 3 soloists who had never in their drilled lives been gripped by anything. Then Lyra sang. She came up out of the mud on her elbows, then her knees, the blind face turning not toward the sound but toward the count, hunting his 2 fingers by the small wind they made. And she found the root and gave it, the fundamental no other throat in the keep could reach, the pitch he had written on the 2nd night without letting himself read its cost. Her voice had no ceiling. It climbed and did not look for one. The 11 did not climb with her. They held their rungs, she rose past them, and the widening gulf between her root and their fixed steps was the whole architecture catching light at once. Every spacing he had measured by lamplight in the cellar, suddenly load-bearing, suddenly true. Under the stone, the drake answered. It came up through the drained floor as a single tone, the wounded thing recognizing its own stolen song in a girl's throat and doubling it. 47 human voices beneath one blind girl's root, the drake under all of them, every part bent to the resolving pitch. The marriage tongue at last spoken in both mouths it had ever belonged to. The chord closed. The downbeat landed where his nail had balanced it. It did not burn them. He had half feared it would, had braced on the iron ring for the smell of cooked wool and the ugliness of winning by fire. None came. What reached the three soloists was not a weapon but a frequency, their own, exactly, found and matched and fed. Each of them was a clean tone and nothing else, a single pure pitch with no give in it, trained to stand alone, and so never taught what a struck wineglass learns the instant a voice finds its note, that the thing which shatters you is not the loudest sound, but the one that is precisely yours. The first soloist's knees went. His narrow tone had nothing to push against. Coherence is not a wall a blade can open. And he folded onto the wet flagstones, hands over his ears, mouth working on a note the chord had already swallowed. The middle one, whose wire had snapped, went after him. His half-step had become the leading tone climbing into Garrick's root. His own weapon sang now in the structure overwhelming him, and a man cannot brace against the brick he himself supplied. He sat down hard in the mud. He did not get up. The third still stood, hand frozen a palm's width from Lyra's jaw, locked in the thickened air. The cord pressed him from every side the way deep water presses a diver, even, total, indifferent. Then Lyra's root rose under that hand and lifted it the way a tide lifts a hull off sand, not struck away, simply unmoored. And the silent soloist was set down on his knees in the cellar muck, lowered like a coat taken off its hook, his perfect, single voice drowned not by a louder one, but by 48 that agreed. 3 flawless soloists, toppled by the flawed. Oral kept his 2 fingers up and let the chord stand. His heart skipped its 4th beat. He conducted through the gap, the count living in muscle where the pulse could not be trusted. Lyra's voice still climbed. The drake held under the stone. The salt twins frayed and gripped. Tomar drove the air past the death of his own breath. Garrick burned cold and patient on the floor beneath the floor, and the whole structure he had spaced and named and chalked onto broken roof tile sounded as one, without a single throat carrying it alone. He had built a thing that did not need him to survive. The herring gulls outside the arrow slit had stopped crying. Cold morning light lay flat on 47 faces no longer waiting to be struck, on 3 inquisitors down in the mud, on a girl risen to her knees with her ruined throat wide open and her whole body pouring the one note that held them all. He did not bring it down. He let it ring. He brought it down at last, the 2 fingers folding shut. And what followed was not silence, but the sound of 47 instruments learning what they had spent. The chord did not end. It came apart. Each voice let go of its rung at a different instant, the way a held breath leaves a drowned man. And in the unbuilding, he heard every cost he had not let himself add up on the second night by lamplight. A woman near the cistern wall stopped on a half note and did not resume it. Then the blood. It came at the ears first, thin, dark threads down the jaw of the man Garrick had braced against. Then at the throat of the salt twin who had frayed and gripped and frayed again. A wet cough, a red string on her chin, the cord under the skin gone where it had held. Tomar had driven air past the floor of his own lungs, and now folded over his knees in the muck, hands flat on the stone, breathing like a cracked bellows that has forgotten its seam. The keep took its weight. The people who had carried it would not, some of them, carry anything again. He read it all at throat height, the only place he had ever been able to read anything. 47 tones, and a third of them now furred, split, dropped a register into ruin. He had spaced them to brace each other against a flood. He had not written a part for what bracing costs. And Lyra. She had climbed and never looked for a ceiling, and a throat that breaks nowhere does not stop because the work is done. Her root thinned to a hiss, then to breath, then to nothing while her chest still tried to make it. He saw the column of her go slack from the crown down, the blind face losing its hunt for his fingers, the wind they made no longer enough to find. She folded a second time into the same mud. This time her hands did not catch her. He came off the well ring before he had decided to. The cold iron left 2 stripes of ache across his palms. He registered them and discarded them, the way one discards a string section already in tune. 3 steps through the muck. He went down on his knees beside her where the silent soloist still knelt unmoored, and he put 2 fingers under the angle of her jaw, in the soft place, and counted. Her pulse was there. Fast, shallow, climbing toward some rate that had no top either, but there, and even. And when he set it against the broken clock in his own chest, the heart that skipped its 4th beat, and had skipped it since he woke in this boy, hers kept the better time. It had always kept the better time. That was the whole reason he had been able to borrow it for the count. Lyra. Not a conductor's word. He said it anyway, low, useless, and she did not answer. He got an arm under her shoulders, the other behind her knees, and stood. She weighed nothing. A spent reed weighs nothing. The stair down out of the cellar was the same stair he had carried no one up in a former life, and he took it a tread at a time, counting her pulse against his own with each step. Her 4 to his missing 4, her steadiness holding the bar his heart kept dropping. Behind and above him the orchestra breathed and bled and did not disperse. They had nowhere to go. Neither, he understood, did he. Cold morning light met him at the cellar mouth, flat and white off the wet courtyard stones, and the herring gulls had begun again over the seawall, indifferent, hungry, arguing about nothing. He laid her in the light. He pressed his fingers to her throat once more, found the small, fast knock, and let the breath he had been holding since the downbeat go out of him slow, the way you ease a held fermata so the silence after it is clean. Then he made himself look back at the thing he had done. 3 inquisitors knelt in his cellar, alive, unmarked, undone. And that was the danger, not the death he had been braced for. Dead soloists are a tragedy the orders write into a ledger and avenge. Living ones, lowered like coats off a hook by a structure built from 47 condemned throats and a chalked method scattered on broken roof tile where any literate hand could copy it. That was not a death. That was a demonstration. He had shown them that the flawed, spaced right and counted true, topple the flawless. He had shown them the arithmetic was teachable. The orders existed because pure single tones were rare and could be owned. He had just proven you did not need them. You needed only the broken, in number, and someone with the ear to space them and the nerve to drop the 12th. They would never tolerate that loose in the world. He knelt in the white light with his sister's pulse under his fingers and his own faltering behind his ribs, and he did the only thing the new body had ever let him do well. He counted. Not her heartbeats now. The cost. A third of the orchestra cracked, the keystone unconscious and would not wake, the method already on the tiles where he could not unwrite it. 9 days had bought him a keep and 1 morning. The morning was the cheap part. The orders had only just heard him. The report that reached the capital carried no count of the dead, and in a house built to keep counts, the absence of one stopped every quill in the scriptorium mid-stroke. 3 names had gone out under seal. 3 came back as nothing, not as bodies, not as martyrs, not even as the clean blank of the silenced, but as a roll call gone unanswered. 3 strings lifted off the bridge while the note hung in the air with no instrument left to own it. The clerks waited for a correction. None arrived. What arrived instead, 9 days late and crusted in road salt, was a courier who did not bring the 3. He brought a shard of roof tile no wider than a spread hand, chalked over in a cramped grid that no one along the long oak table could read, and every one of them could feel was meant to be read. That was the wound in it. A cipher you cannot break is a wall, and the order had grown fat behind walls. A method you can see is teachable is a door someone has propped open with a stone. The shard went hand to gloved hand up the table, and where it passed, the talk thinned to nothing. The way a hall goes quiet when a player turns a page, everyone realizes they are also expected to turn. They called the woman who governed the order the first cantor, though she had not sung in 30 years. Her gift had hardened into administration. A single pure tone kept sheathed somewhere behind her sternum, like a blade no living clerk had seen drawn. She held the tile to the lamp. She read enough. Not the marks. She could no more parse them than the clerks could. But the argument standing underneath them, plain as load on a beam. That one owned voice could be answered, braced against, and pulled down by a mass of voices nobody had thought worth chaining. The whole estate of the order rested on scarcity. The pure tone was rare, and the rare could be hunted, collared, licensed, leased back to the frightened at interest. The shard in her hand said the rare was optional. It said the broken would serve, in number, spaced right and counted true, and it said so in a hand a literate child could copy onto the next tile, and the next after that. She set it down without haste. She did not call it a defeat. A defeat is a thing you avenge, tally, and file under closed. She let the word heresy out first, testing it the way you test a string you suspect is false, and then she reached past it for the older, heavier word the order kept locked away for the rare matters that menaced not its pride, but its existence. An erasure class doctrine. Not to be tried. Not to be made example of in a square with a crowd and a pyre, because a pyre teaches the watching crowd that the thing was worth burning. Unwritten instead. Scrubbed from tile and throat and recollection until no surviving mind held the shape of the arithmetic, until the very idea that the flawed could topple the flawless went back to being unthinkable, which was the only condition under which the order could go on charging for the flawless. The bells of the basilica did not ring for it. Crusades of the unwriting kind move quietest. Couriers went out instead, scores of them, each carrying the same short writ, copied in the same indifferent hand. And the copying alone took the scriptorium 2 days and a barrel of oak gall ink. Every sheet sealed in green wax pressed with the closed mouth that was the order's mark. Garrison commanders unrolled it and reread the place name twice, because none of them had heard of it. A barony on a seawall. A drained keep. A boy baron with a bad heart and a blind sister, who 8 days ago had rated a single steward's writ and a single steward's clemency, and who now had been lifted clean off that ledger and re-entered at the top of another. The short, terrible roll the order kept for whole nations gone wrong, beside which a barony of 47 looked like a clerical error someone had let stand too long. The arithmetic Oral knew had run on 9 days. 9 days from a cellar of dissonance to a chord that stood 3 soloists in the mud. The order's arithmetic ran the other way now and had no top to it. It counted not days but distances, not players but provinces. Every league of road between the capital and the sea a measure to be marched. Every literate hand between here and Solvane a throat that might copy a tile. They began to draw the war roll. Companies of soloists pulled from a dozen garrisons, named one at a time, chosen. He would have recognized the method had he seen it. Not for brilliance, but for how each braced the failure of the last. The pure tones, ranked and stacked, a wall rebuilt against a door. In the cold scriptorium, the first cantor watched the green seals dry, and did not pretend, even to herself, that this was punishment. Punishment is for an enemy you have measured and found smaller. This was fear, dressed in procedure, marching south in good order. One drained keep on the edge of the empire had made an empire afraid of a sound it could not yet hear. They were coming to unwrite him. All of them. And the count had only just begun. In the life before this one, he had never once touched the instrument he played. The conductor's hands stay lifted, clean, sovereign above 100 professionals who sharpened their own reeds and buried their own dead. His palms were split now. He carried water down the cellar stair in a cracked ewer and tipped it into mouths too spent to lift toward it. And the arithmetic he had been proud of, 9 days, 47, spaced and counted true, turned out to carry a remainder he had declined to set on the page. 4 would not be carried up alive. He counted them the way he counted everything, by interval. The lutenist who had given the low brace stopped between one shallow breath and the next, no sound to mark the rest. 2 field mages who had held the inner ring lay cooling with their fingers still curled as if around a rope. The 4th was a boy whose name he had not known until Halvik read it off the writ. He learned it over the body. He said it once aloud and let it go. They buried the 4 outside the seawall at low tide, in the only ground soft enough to take a spade, while a pair of herring gulls worked the tide line for whatever the morning had killed. No bell. The order's couriers were not the only ones who understood that bells teach a crowd what was worth the ringing. He set the dead side by side and spaced them as he had spaced them living, an arm's length, no closer, because some habit of the ear refused to let even corpses crowd one another into dissonance. Lime, then sand. Then the flat, cold light that comes off the north water in the hour before the sun commits to anything. The living he reorganized on the climb back up. It was the only verb that held him steady. He moved the spent into the dry upper rooms the flood had at last surrendered, ranked not by the rank they had carried down into the dark, but by what remained in each throat. He set the 2 who could still stand to copying the method onto fresh tile. Scratch and fire and cool, scratch and fire and cool, because a written part outlives the player, and he meant this part to outlast every throat in the building, his own first of all. A girl with a burned hand mixed the slip. A man who had clerked taxes before the collar ruled the guidelines straight. Without anyone declaring it, the keep had begun to behave like an order of its own, one that charged nothing for the rare, having decided the rare was a lie sold at interest. He understood, climbing, what had changed in him, and he did not care for its shape. A conductor spends sound. He shapes a thing that vanishes as it is made, and the worst cost of a botched downbeat is a notice in a paper nobody keeps. He was not spending sound anymore. He was spending lives, deciding, each time 2 fingers rose, which throat would brace which would hold a rung, and which would be permitted to fail quietly into the rest. And the difference between a master and a murderer, he was beginning to suspect, lay only in how honestly each kept the ledger. Lyra had not surfaced on the 7th day, nor the 8th. On the 9th, she came up the way a held note finally releases. No drama, simply present where a moment earlier there had been only the even, shallow, faster than his pulse he had counted under her jaw with 2 fingers in the muck. He was sitting beside her cot when her breathing changed key. Her sightless eyes stayed shut. Her hand found the edge of his sleeve and stayed there. "How many?" she asked, because she had always heard the absence in a room before she heard whatever filled it. 4. He did not soften the number. She would have caught the lie as a wrong interval and trusted nothing after it. He told her the names in the order he had laid them in the sand, and she repeated each once, fixing it the way she fixed everything. In the one ledger the order could never march in and scrub, the inside of a living skull. Then he sat in the cold and did the sum he had been dodging since the writ shard left for the capital. They were coming to unwrite him, all of them, by a method that ran without a top to it. Provinces, leagues, a war roll of the flawless stacked like a wall rebuilt against a door. To answer it, he would have to ask these throats to open again. Some would not survive a second full route. He knew already which. He could feel himself even now pricing them. This voice worth a measure, that one a phrase, the girl with the burned hand worth more whole and copying than spent and silent. And the cold of it was not that the pricing felt monstrous. The cold of it was how well he did it. Lyra's grip tightened, steady, keeping better time than the heart skipping its fourth beat beneath his own ribs. He turned his hand inside hers and held it. Outside, the gulls gave up the tide line and lifted. He would ask them to sing again. This time, he would write a part for what the bracing cost. A line for the throats it would empty, scored before the downbeat, paid in advance and out loud. He raised his eyes to the ceilingless dark above her cot and began, quietly, to count. 43 squares of fired tile caught the dawn and held it cold, each scratched with the same notation in the tax clerk's straight hand, and the people arranged themselves along the floor before he raised a finger to ask. That was the change. A month back he had been a stranger in a borrowed body with a bad heart, begging one clean note off a cellar that meant to bury him. Now they came up the stair in the order he had taught, by what each throat still held, not by which collar it had once worn, and stood an arm's length apart because the spacing had become law without his ever speaking it aloud. He gave the thing a name on the fourth day. Not for himself. A practice with a name could be argued in a writ, entered on a roll, set against the leagues of the flawless like a wall against a door. An unnamed habit was only weather. He called it the consort, wrote the word once at the head of the master tile, and underlined it with the same ruled line that guided the parts. The doctrine was short, because he distrusted long ones. Every voice gets a written part. Every part is copied twice, once for the throat, once for the wall, so the music outlasts the singer. Rehearsal stands at both turns of the tide, and no working happens that has not first been paid for on the tile. A line scored for what the bracing will empty, named before the downbeat, sung by no one. The cost goes above the music, not below it. He would not let it hide in a footnote. They drilled the method until the children could chant it, scratch and fire and cool. The girl with the burned hand ran the slip now without being told, and graded the other's work by tapping each tile with a fingernail and listening for the flat ring of a flaw. She had become, without anyone voting it so, the one who said which clay could stand. The clerk kept the roll. Two who had carried high collars down into the dark took dictation from a net mender who could not write, but could hold a 40-bar line whole in his head and give it back without a seam. The hard one was a thatcher named Vale, who had screamed something past mending on the second route and had not opened his mouth since. Not to eat without turning away, not to answer his own name. Oral did not order him to sing. He gave him the lamp. Each rehearsal the thatcher carried the flame down the rank and set it where the light was wanted, counting the spacing with his hands. An arm's length, an arm's length. And somewhere in the counting his breathing began, after 9 evenings, to keep time with the room. On the 10th, he hummed under the tutti, a half-step flat, almost nothing. Oral marked the pitch and wrote a part for it the next morning. Low, easy, a line a ruined throat could hold, and moved the lamp into another's hands so the thatchers were free. He never said why. This was the difference he had bought with the 9th day. A master spends what vanishes. He had spent throats, and meant never again to spend them in silence. So the consort sang its own debts first. Before any working the company performed the cost, a slow figure naming who might not climb back up from the root, scored in the open where the named could hear it and refuse. And only after that did the 2 fingers rise. 3 refused the first week. He entered each refusal on the roll as cleanly as he entered the names of the dead, because a company that punishes the no is only a press gang with better manners, and he had buried enough of those by lime and sand to know the smell of one. Word came up the coast in pieces, carried by a herring boat that wanted nothing but to be gone again. The war roll of the flawless had reached the capital. A league was being raised. The keep and everything scratched across its tiles was to be unwritten. He copied faster. He set a second wall going in the dry room, tile behind tile. the method made redundant across 2 surfaces and 40 heads, because the order could burn a building but not a thing fired into clay and memorized into bone. Steadiness was the only answer he had. He kept the verbs steady and let the rest fail quietly into the rest. At the evening tide they ran the whole of it for the first time, all 43, the paid cost and the working both, the thatcher's low line laid under everything like a keel a hull is built down onto. Lyra stood at the center where her ear could survey the field, sightless, conducting nothing, hearing all of it. The note landed clean. For the length of one held breath, the cellar that had wanted him dead sounded like an instrument that knew its own name. And the cold north light came flat through the high slit and lay along the tile without judging any of it. He counted the cost line once more beneath the music. Every throat the coming writ might take from him, summed honestly, out loud. He did not flinch from the number. He raised 2 fingers. They were his. The league came at the low tide, and he did not strike the set. 43 throats held their tiles, an arm's length apart, while the yard above filled with the smell of horse and hot sealing wax, and the banners of the flawless went stiff in the wind off the water. He climbed the stair alone. At the slit of the door waited an inquisitor in a gray cope, a single perfect voice, grown like a pearl around its own grit, the sort of throat that had been taught from the cradle that the old burning speech belonged to it and to no one beneath it. The man carried a writ. He carried behind him 100 swords and the lawful right to lime the cellar by morning. Auril offered him a parley and one question: whether the singing lived in the throat or in the room. The inquisitor answered the only way his church knew how. He sang, one syllable of the dragon tongue, clean as a struck rule, and the lintel stone over the door wept grit and split along a line straighter than any Auril had drawn under a part. So the rumor was true. The fire speech was real, hoarded whole in a handful of flawless larynxes across the kingdom, and the whole apparatus of the Inquisition stood on a simple sum. Break the one throat, and the key was gone. A monopoly the width of a man's neck. Auril went back down 3 steps and lifted 2 fingers. They sang the cost first, as the doctrine demanded, the slow figure naming who among them might not climb up from this route, scored in the open where the named could refuse. And none did, not tonight. Then the working, not against the man's note, under it. 43 cracked throats, each holding the small piece the burned-hand girl had graded it fit to hold, the netmender's 40-bar spine beneath them, Vale's ruined low line laid down like a keel, and the dragon tongue rose out of the broken company entire, every flaw canceling its neighbor's flaw until the sum rang true. The split lintel did not finish breaking. It held, stone knitting to stone along the very seam the inquisitor had opened, mended by no single voice the man could find in silence. He went pale at that. He understood the arithmetic before Auril said it aloud. A thing that takes 1 perfect throat to do and 40 imperfect ones to undo cannot be kept by killing one. What followed was not a victory, and Auril was clerk enough not to write it as one. It was a treaty. The League could burn a building. It could not burn the method now fired into 2 walls of clay and memorized into 40 skulls. And it could not afford the long account of unmaking a thing that copied itself faster than swords could reach it. So they bargained. The Inquisitor's master wanted the cellar legible, a name a writ could bind. Auril gave them one. He let himself be entered on their roll as a baron of a coast worth nothing, a title he valued for exactly 1 property, that a baron could be written into a charter where a hole full of outcasts could not. And in exchange, the keep stood, and the road north stayed open, and any throat the church had condemned could walk it unhunted to his door. Passage and refuge scored into law. He signed it in the same straight clerk's hand he scratched into tile. They struck the parley at slack water. The 100 swords turned and went, slower than they came. He did not celebrate. He went down and entered the night honestly, the seam mended, The cost paid in full and no one spent. The treaty's exact margins. The price of the bread it would take to feed whoever the road brought. The burned-hand girl tapped the new lintel with a fingernail and listened a long moment for the flat ring of a flaw and did not find one. Lyra stood at the center where her ear surveyed the field, sightless, and named the chord they had made by its proper interval, no warmer than that. Vale set the lamp where the light was wanted. The cold north light came flat through the high slit and lay along the tiles without judging any of it. Word went out the way water finds a crack. A herring boat carried it first, then a salt cart, then mouths he never saw. That there was a baron on the gray coast who took the churches condemned and the collars discarded and made them sing as one throat. That the dragon tongue could be held by the broken if it were broken small enough and counted true. That a part copied twice outlived the singer. Across the border, the sums began to change in cellars like the one that had meant to bury him. Mages under sentence, throats already measured for the lime, heard a number that did not require them to be flawless, only to stand an arm's length apart and hold the small piece they could still hold. Some of them started walking. It was not one. He knew the difference between a chord held and a war ended, and this was the first. The breath you take and sustain while the bow stays on the string and the next movement waits unwritten in the dark beyond the stand. The keep would fill. The road would bring more flaws than clay, more grief than tile. He had 9 days once. Now he had a treaty's worth of borrowed time and a heart that still kept poor time underneath it all. He set a fresh tile blank at the head of the dry room wall. He wet the slip. He lifted 2 fingers into the cold light and held them there and waited for the room to be ready to begin.